It's Rusty with Springfield Leather again. I thought we might cover a couple of different ways of sewing your materials together. We're going to cover hand stitching, which would be a saddle stitch, and then we're also going to cover this handy dude, which is a stitching awl. There's a time and a place for everything, as they say, and a stitching awl is one of those things. A lot of times a person will use it for repairs. On the outside of the package it shows tents and canvas and convertible tops and so on and so forth, and all of those things are fine and wonderful. I've sold them to people that were making sheaths. I've sold them to people doing all kinds of things. They give you a stitch much like a sewing machine would. A sewing machine gives you a lock stitch where the top thread comes down, comes back up. It doesn't ever actually pass through to the other side, so it just locks by overlapping the underside thread over the top thread, which is fine, except for when one side of it gets frayed, then it'll begin to pull apart. And if you've ever had a thread on your shirt or something, you could just pull it apart to where it would just fray out. It's a handy deal and it works great, and I'll show you how to use it. And then we're also going to discuss saddle stitching, which will be done with harness needles and some thread. That style of stitch does pass through. One comes from one side, becomes the bottom, the bottom comes through, becomes the top thread. It's a much stronger stitch for projects such as belts and holsters and so on and so forth, because when it gets frayed on one side, it doesn't, or when it gets cut on one side, it doesn't fray, it doesn't come unloose from that point on. But let's get started with this. I'll show you how to use this. A stitching awl has a needle just exactly like a sewing machine would. It's got a groove on one side of it, and that groove is for the thread to be inside the needle. It doesn't allow friction to be created on that side of the needle. And so what's important about that is that you need to know where that groove's at all times. So as a habit, when I pick it up, I always put that groove away from me or to my right, one way or the other, which is fine. In order to get that thread through on both sides, you're going to pull it up to where you can get a hold of the thread and pull it through on the other side. Now once you've done that, you need to know how much thread it's going to take to go from here to here. Usually, if it would reach like that, you would make it, but it would be a much better suggestion to do about twice that. Thread's cheap. You aren't going to waste nearly as much as one might think. So now that you pull your needle back through, you've got thread on both sides of it. So compared to a sewing machine, this would be your bobbin thread, this would be your top thread. All right? So we're going to take off and we'll make our first stitch, and when you pull that down, it'll create that loop on that same side. The reason it does that is because this groove is holding on to that wax thread. It'll create a groove or a loop 99% of the time on the same side, every time, the same way, every time. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull that thread, you're going to put it through the hole and pull it through. And you need to do it the exact same way every single time. If you switch and go back the other way, you've actually tied it into a knot. So you're going to give it a pull, and that's the tension. You've created the tension on that. And you'll just go on to your next stitch. Pull it up the exact same way every single time, and it'll look the same every single time. That'll give you a consistent stitch. Now if you pull on it, and it's probably pretty hard to see, let's see if I can pull it this way. If you pull on it and the knot comes through and you can see it, simple fix. Pull it back down into the leather from the back side. Ideally a stitch, the knot will land inside the material, not on the top, not on the bottom. If you find that you're sewing with something and you can't get the knot hidden, you either have too big a thread or too thin a material for the thread. So it works the same way with a sewing machine. Once you get to where you're going to go, you make your final stitch, and instead of pulling it through and having a big ugly knot, you turn that needle around to where the groove is on the other side and you back stitch. Now I've made these stitches pretty large just for the idea of you being able to see them, but again, you just turn around and go right back where you came from, the exact same way you came. You'll want to go back 2 or 3 stitches and you're done. Cut it off, take a lighter and burn it. It's good to go. Now, whenever you start with one of these, you need to lock the stitch at the beginning as well. That stitch isn't dire that you lock it, but it would be a good idea. So you've locked it at the beginning, you've locked it at the end, you're done. Just cut it off flush. Handy tool. Not necessarily something that I would use to do holsters and sheaths. Like I said, I've sold them to people for that purpose, but teach their own.